Good morning. Good morning. I'm Joanne Myers, Director of Merrill House Programs, and I'd like to welcome our members, guests, and C-SPAN to the Carnegie Council's Books for Breakfast. This morning, our guest speaker is Peter Taylor, and he is going to be discussing his book, Behind the Mask, the IRA and Sinn Fein. As many of you are already aware, after several years of internecine struggles, Sinn Fein, the political wing of the IRA, agreed to a ceasefire. With this truce, the IRA and Sinn Fein, led by Gerry Adams, were permitted to enter into the long-running multi-party party talks on the fate of Northern Ireland. These talks, which are sponsored by both the British and the Irish governments and headed by former U.S. Senator George Mitchell, are aimed at ending nearly 30 years of religious and political conflict that has claimed thousands of lives. These talks, which are scheduled to resume on January 12th, have created the greatest hope in a generation for a settlement. But whether Sinn Fein and the Unionists are prepared to make the compromises necessary to end this conflict are still not known. As Mr. Taylor points out in his book, getting to the negotiating table is only the beginning. We do not know how serious Mr. Adams is in seeking a settlement, nor whether his supporters will agree with his decision. Our guest speaker this morning is BBC reporter Peter Taylor. He will shed light on this situation and share with us his years of investigative reporting about the very complex interrelationship of the IRA and its political wing, Sinn Fein. Since the early 70s, Mr. Taylor has reported on Northern Ireland and has made over 50 documentaries on the conflict, which have been shown on the British television news show This Week and for BBC TV's Panorama. In addition, he has written several series on this struggle for British television, including Families at War, States of Terror, 25 Bloody Wars, and Defense of the Realm. Behind the Mask is Mr. Taylor's fifth book on the subject. His others include Beating the Terrorists, which won the 1980 Cobden Trust Award for the greatest contribution to human rights, Stalker, The Search for Truth, Families at War, and States of Terror. Won't you please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our guest, Peter Taylor.
Thank you, Joanne. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great privilege to be invited to speak to you all this morning, and Sue, my wife, and I are very glad to be here. I thought the best way of talking about the book and the series and my experiences over the past, now it's 26 years this month actually, of reporting not just Northern Ireland but Ireland and the Anglo-Irish conflict, is to read a few extracts from the book that I hope will give an insight into what the book is about, what the book contains, and how I believe and hope it is relevant to this hugely important peace process, which is only just beginning. My own introduction to Northern Ireland started literally 26 years ago this month, when as a young, naive, innocent, ignorant reporter, I was sent over to cover Bloody Sunday, the civil rights march in Londonderry, when British paratroopers sadly shot dead 13 unarmed Catholics. It had a profound impact on me and everyone else who was there that day, and I felt ashamed at what had happened, totally bemused at why it had happened, and ashamed at my own ignorance. And I remember saying to myself at that time that I had to try and find out why this had happened, why there was conflict, what the roots of the Anglo-Irish conflict were, and to try to understand. And once I had begun that process, to try, in all humility, to help explain it to, unfortunately, a largely uncaring and ignorant British audience. In the sense, when I went over to Derry on that day, I was representing the vast majority of the British public who also knew very little and cared even less. So the book and the series, which over here is called Behind the Mask, and in the UK is known as Provos, the same book, are the result of 26 years of involvement in Northern Ireland. People say to me, how long did it take you to do Provos or Behind the Mask? And I say, over a quarter of a century. But in reality, it was about 18 months. I think what made the book and the series different from most, if not all, of the other programs and books written about the Republican movement, which I take to be, for reasons of convenience, the IRA and Sinn Fein, although technically the Republican movement is the IRA. If you talk about the movement to Republicans, they know that to be the IRA, not the IRA and Sinn Fein, but it's a convenient shorthand for everybody to lump the two together, because they are together. I mean, they are different sides of the same coin. I might talk a bit more about that later. What I tried to do was to challenge the stereotypes of those involved in the conflict. The book and the series are not designed to be an apologia for the provisional IRA and Sinn Féin, and I think if any of you saw the Frontline 2-hour edition of our 4 hours, I hope you would think that that was the case, and the same applies to the book. What I tried to do was to provide an insight into the kind of people who have been involved in, sadly, some of the most horrendous acts of terrorism, in inverted commas. It's a word I use very, very seldom, over the past 25 years. What makes them do it? What kind of people are they? And when you get to know many of them, which I have done over the years, and I've grown up with Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness and many of them, you know that they are ordinary people just like you and me. Now that may seem contradictory, because you and me don't go around killing and maiming people. That is the great contradiction. So I tried to sort of shed light onto the motivation, the mentality and the strategy of the provisional IRA and Sinn Féin. The stereotype, this is not in any sense, I hasten to excuse what they have done. I mean, we, the British, have done some pretty awful things too, but Bloody Sunday was one of them. I should also add that my access to the Republican movement was matched by my access to British sources, to current and former chief constables, current and former generals, current and former ministers, John Major, senior civil servants, and the intelligence services, because I regard my job as trying to get as close to the truth as it is possible to get, which in matters Irish is extraordinarily difficult. So it is not the result of a sort of one-sided investigation. Far from it. I wanted to make that clear. The stereotype of the IRA man or woman is that he or she is a bloodthirsty killer wearing a mask and thirsting for blood, if you like. That is the sort of popular tabloid British stereotype. It is not accurate. One of the former IRA people I got to know well over the years was a man called Tommy McKerney. Tommy McKerney, who spent a life sentence for murder, is a highly intelligent, highly articulate, you would say misguided young man. I just want to read you an extract about McKerney that will give you some idea of the kind of person he is and the kind of family he came from. And when I was writing the book, Sue, my wife, would read some of the drafts because she is my most fearsome critic. When she read the introduction to this chapter, she was astonished, and she was astonished because Tommy McKerney had been studying for A-levels. Now, I'm not quite sure what the American educational equivalent of A-levels is, but when you're 17 and 18 in our equivalent of high school, you have very tough exams, which are the gold standard. I mean, there is no examination below college level which is more difficult or more vital because it decides whether you go to university or college or whatever. They're absolutely critical. And to young men and women in Northern Ireland in the 60s and the early 70s, they were even more vital, given the problems that Catholics had in getting, in particular, professional jobs. And Susan was astonished to read that Tommy McKerney had been studying for his A-levels. And I say, For many teenagers across Northern Ireland, Monday the 9th of August 1971 was a special date which had nothing to do with internment. That was the date of internment without trial, when the British Army and the RUC swooped and locked up literally hundreds of Republican suspects. It was the day their A-level results were announced. That morning, two young men destined to join the IRA and rise to prominence in the provisionals were waiting for the postman. 18-year-old Tommy McKerney was asleep in his bed in the village of Moy, County Tyrone, where his father ran the local butcher's shop. He'd been out the night before and was sleeping in. His father came into his bedroom to awaken him with a letter containing his results. They meant a lot to Tommy, as they would effectively decide his future. His goal was Queen's University, Belfast. Mr. McKerney gave Tommy the letter and told him internment was in. It was the most amazing conjunction, Tommy remembers. There I was in bed, reading my A-level results and trying to take in the fact that the British government had introduced internment without trial in the north of Ireland. Tommy lay in bed thinking. He'd passed 3 A-levels, but the results were not good enough for Queen's. It's Queen's University in Belfast. His future stretched out before him with, as he saw it, few options for a young Catholic from County Tyrone. He could go to college and become a teacher, as many of his contemporaries did, or emigrate to England or elsewhere, as did a good many others. In 1971, discrimination was still endemic, and job prospects, even for bright young Catholics with degrees, were limited. I'm glad to say that has changed considerably. Tommy was acutely aware of the explosion in the north and the circumstances that had triggered it, and now fueled it. Lying there, he thought about his future, and then I quote from what Tommy told me. In my view, internment was like a straw which broke the camel's back. 300 to 400 people lifted in a swoop on Monday morning and then brutalized as it soon emerged. Again, sadly, a number of Republican suspects were brutalized. That moment was also decisive in my own evolution. I had reached an age where I was capable of taking an independent decision. I decided to join the Provisional IRA. Then I say to him, were you prepared to kill people? I was prepared, yes. As part of an army and part of an armed Irish Republican army, yes. Tommy was subsequently given life for the murder of an off-duty UDR man. And what you have to understand, or what people have to understand, is that they do regard themselves as being part of an army, an irregular guerrilla army. There is absolutely no question about that. They are highly disciplined, they are highly motivated, and they are tightly controlled. And Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness and the leadership of the Republican movement stand at the head of the organisation. Tommy McKerney's family have suffered perhaps more than any other family in Northern Ireland, certainly on the Republican side. That McKerney did life for the murder of an off-duty UDR, that's territorial part-time soldier. His brother, Porrick McKerney, escaped from the maze in 1983 and was shot dead by the SAS at Loch Gall when an IRA unit that was ruthlessly effective were ambushed by the SAS, attacking a police station. His younger brother, Sean, was blown up by his own bomb. And the only brother who was not involved in the IRA, Kevin, was gunned down in his father's butcher's shop by loyalists. And it is widely believed that the man behind that, and I can say it because he's now dead, was Billy Wright, who was assassinated, murdered, call it what you will, by Inler, not the Provisionals, by Inler in the maze only a few days ago. So, the IRA are not mindless hooligans and thugs, as Sir James Glover, a former British Army general and intelligence chief, whom I also interviewed, pointed out in a famous report that he wrote in 1978, and it was not popular with his superiors because it actually challenged the stereotype of the IRA man. What I've also tried to do in the book is to show the way in which the British intelligence services liaised on and off with the leadership of the IRA, with the IRA's Army Council, over a period of 25 years, on and off, which was always done in the most top-secret conditions for obvious reasons, but nevertheless happened. So on the one hand, you've got government condemning, attacking the men of violence, as you would expect, and that inevitably happens because any government has to have the population on its side in the propaganda war, which is almost as important as the real, quotes, war in Northern Ireland. But at the same time, had to find a way out. And long ago, the British realized, quite rightly, that a military defeat in strict military terms of the Provisional IRA was simply not on the cards. By the end of the 1980s and the early 1990s, the IRA had also recognised that they weren't going to beat the Brits out of Northern Ireland militarily, that the Brits were simply not going to get up on the next boat and leave. The British are not going to do that and won't do that because there are 1 million Protestants in Northern Ireland who wish, as of now, to remain part of the United Kingdom. So that simply isn't going to happen. So that realisation gradually dawned on both sides. But throughout the period, there were secret contacts with the IRA's Army Council through a person in Londonderry/Derry, who for obvious reasons has to remain nameless, who was the conduit for the intelligence services for MI6, which is our foreign intelligence service, like your CIA, and latterly, more recently, through MI5, which is our domestic intelligence service. And this person played an absolutely pivotal role for more than 25 years, and his story is the great untold story of the Troubles. The first contacts were made back in 1972 by a remarkable man called Frank Steele. Frank Steele was then the MI6 officer stationed in Northern Ireland, and Frank I met well over a year ago, and he was dying of cancer. And I got to know Frank very well, and he took me into his confidence and trust and painted in the picture of what was happening in 1972 that led to the first meeting between the Provisionals and the British government. The British Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, William Whitelaw. At that meeting that was held in London, Gerry Adams was there and Martin McGuinness were there, and it was effectively the leadership of the IRA. There were no Sinn Fein people there, it was an IRA meeting. And Frank Steele set it up. And the series in the book came to mean a huge amount to Frank Steele because he was keen to set the record straight. He knew he was dying and just wanted people to understand what had happened from the British side. And I just want to read a short extract where Frank Steele describes meeting for the first time Gerry Adams, who was then alleged to be the commander of the IRA's Ballymurphy battalion. And certainly that's what Frank Steele had been told by British intelligence. And he had never met Gerry Adams before. Before the meeting, this is the meeting to set up the logistics for the big meeting between the IRA and the British. Before the meeting, Steele had been briefed that the young Gerry Adams had been an effective commander of the Provisionals Ballymurphy Battalion and was a senior officer of the Belfast Brigade. Adams has always denied IRA membership, and Adams has never been convicted of IRA membership. He has been charged with it, but the case was dropped because the Lord Chief Justice decided the evidence wasn't there. Steele was therefore expecting to meet, quotes, an arrogant, streetwise young thug, and was surprised when Adams turned out to be a, quotes, very personable, intelligent, articulate, and self-disciplined man. And if any of you have met Gerry Adams, that's a pretty accurate description of Mr. Adams. Steele believed that these were the qualities that made him so, quotes, dangerously effective. Then I quote from what Frank Steele told me. Gerry Adams obviously had a terrific future ahead of him, whatever he did, because of his qualities. Remember, this is 1972 we're talking about. As we were about to leave, I said, "You don't want to spend the rest of your life on the run from us British, do you? What do you really want to do?" Adams said, "I want to go to university and get a degree." I said, "Well, we're not stopping you. We're not stopping you. All you've got to do is renounce violence and you can go to university and get a degree." Adams grinned and said, "No, I've got to help to get rid of you British first." And that is what made Steele realise that the people that he was dealing with, and Gerry Adams and the others he met, like Martin McGuinness, were not quite what he had expected. And if you see Mr. Adams and Mr. McGuinness today, they bear little relation to the sort of stereotypical Republican. I then go on to look at the way in which, the modalities in which the 1975 truce, IRA truce, which is mirrored by the current cessation, truce, ceasefire, call it what you will, came about. And again, the person who was involved was an MI6 officer called Michael Oatley. Michael Oatley, through the person in Derry, whom I refer to as the contact, opened up channels once again to the Provisional Army Council, the strategy being all along to persuade them that they were not going to get what they wanted by killing people. This has been the British strategy for 25 years and more, to convince them that they were not going to win. They were wasting their time, they were spilling other people's blood and their own blood unnecessarily, and the way forward was political. That message finally got through. And it got through to enough members of the Army Council in 1975 for there to be a truce. Now, what is remarkable about this period is this was well before the IRA split as it did in 1986 when Rory O'Brody walked off to form Republican Sinn Fein. That O'Brody, whom I've known again for a long time, told me on several occasions down the years that he was convinced that the British wanted to leave Northern Ireland because on Christmas Day 1974 he'd received a written message from the British saying they wished to disengage from Northern Ireland. And I'd always said to him, well, where's the message? Let me have a look at it. And Mr. O'Brody would say, well, it doesn't exist. And I said, well, if it's as you say it is, I cannot imagine that it's been thrown in some Republican waste paper basket somewhere. It must, and Rory said it doesn't exist. When I came to research the series and to write the book, one of the biggest challenges, if you like, was to try and find out what really happened. If the British did say to the IRA in 1975 that they wanted to discuss what O'Brody said were, quote, structures of disengagement. And I'm just going to read you a very short extract that sets up what actually happened on that Christmas Day, 1974. The IRA had declared a Christmas truce that was sort of background to the secret contacts again. And this is what actually happened. There's a chapter called Truce. On Christmas Day 1974, Rory O'Brody was at home in Roscommon, preparing for the domestic festivities when, looking out of the window, he was amazed to see the contact getting out of a car, the contact being the person from Londonderry. Friends might drop by on Christmas Day, but the last person he expected to see was the man from the north, because O'Brody knew the contact quite well. He knew it must be important for the contact to forego his own Christmas Day celebrations and set out on the long and tedious drive south. And it is a very long, tedious drive from the north to Roscommon, as some of you may know. He'd brought a message in the form of a letter written in his own handwriting, which he said had come from the British government. The astonished O'Brody read the letter, which, he says, stated that the British wished to meet the Republican movement to devise structures of British withdrawal from Ireland, or structures of disengagement from Ireland. He can't remember the precise words. I have no doubt whatsoever that that letter was delivered, and that letter did mention structures of disengagement, or words to that effect. Then I write, I'd previously heard about the Christmas Day letter and its alleged mention of structures of disengagement without knowing the background to it, and had always remained sceptical. Then I go on to say that I find it surprising that the letter didn't exist. The only way to find out what had been said was to gain access to the Republican movement's minutes of those critical meetings. No easy task, as no journalist had ever been given access to them before. Finally, someone somewhere agreed that I could see them, and a complex logistical operation was put in place in which I had to travel to the minutes since they could not travel to me. I was not to know where I had been or where I had seen them, and was instructed to go to a location far away in the Irish Republic, where I was assured I would be met and taken care of. And I was taken to a house where I was shown the minutes. We finally arrived at a house in the country where I was ushered into a bedroom. The minutes were lying on a dressing table, neatly arranged in a red file. I was brought tea and fruitcake and instructed that I could dictate sections into my tape recorder, but on no account could I take the minutes away. I pulled up a chair and sat there for 5 hours, speaking into my tape recorder and at times scarcely believing what I was reading. I had to keep reminding myself that these were the provisionals' minutes, and their accuracy could only be authenticated by the equivalent minutes taken by Her Majesty's government. Knowing that this was out of the question, I had to read the provisionals' version and make a judgment. Certain elements of the minutes tallied with what I already knew to be fact. Now, to cut a long story short, the minutes, which I actually quote in the book, in the American edition too, do actually talk about structured disengagement. But the book also contextualizes what was actually said and what the British were really saying. I mean, what I think the strategy in 75 was to encourage the provisionals to give up what they call the armed struggle and to enter politics. And the carrot was, if violence ends, everything is on the table. It's not unlike the current process. You know, we're not ruling anything out. Nothing is ruled in. Nothing is ruled out. Nothing is agreed till everything is agreed. It's a tabula rasa. It's a clean sheet. It's really up to you. Really up to you. And the British position has been, it's up to the people of Northern Ireland, and in the end the people of Ireland, North and South, to work out their own future. It is not for the British to impose a solution, and you have to recognise there are a million Protestants in the North. And in the end, as the British have said quite rightly to the Republican movement, the people you've got to convince is not us, because we have no, quote, selfish, strategic or economic interest in Northern Ireland, and we really don't. You've got to convince your fellow Irish men and women of a Protestant and Unionist persuasion that they're better off in a different political structure in Ireland than the existing one. You've got to persuade them, and that message, has gradually got home. And that was the message that the British were sending via the MI6, via Michael Oakley and his successors, to the IRA's Army Council in 1975. Bringing us right up to date, I think the background to the current second ceasefire, and there's no guarantee it is going to last. I mean, I hope it will. The British government hopes it will, and the IRA and Sinn Fein hope it will, but it is contingent. It is contingent upon there being reciprocation by the Unionists and encouragement by the British. The current process came about for two reasons. First of all, Gerry Adams, on behalf of the Republican movement, met John Hume on behalf of nationalist Ireland, if you like, and began the dialogue whereby they tried to work out a way of achieving their aim, which is a legitimate aim of a united Ireland, without resorting to violence. That started actually 10 years ago in 1988, so it's been a long time coming to any kind of fruition. Now, we're not at fruition stage yet. That's the first thing. The second thing was the renewed contacts between the intelligence services, initially again through Michael Oakley and MI6, taken over then by MI5, with the IRA's Army Council, initially through Martin McGuinness, through an initial meeting in January 1991, in which the whole thing began to open up, and that's where we are now. I have no doubt, and I say it in the series and I say it in the book, that the Republican movement is absolutely serious in wishing to find a political solution to the problem. I met a lot of Republicans during the making of the series and the writing of the book, many of whom had been active IRA men and women, most of whom had done time in jail, some of whom had spent almost 20 years in jail. And the most telling remark came at the end of the series from Brendan Hughes. Now, Hughes is a Republican folklore hero, a sort of contemporary Joe Cahill, because Hughes was the commander of the Belfast Brigade, alleged commander of the Belfast Brigade in the 70s. He escaped from prison, worked undercover with an alias as a toy salesman in Belfast, was subsequently arrested, led the first hunger strike, absolutely critical, historical Republican figure. And at the end, I said to Brendan Hughes, "Is the war over?" And he paused and he looked at me and he said, "I think it is." And there was a pause, and I said, "Why?" And there was a sigh from Brendan Hughes, and the sigh echoed 25, 30 years of what he would call struggle. And you could see images of the hunger strike fleeting across his eyes, and all the people, the friends that he'd lost, and the comrades that he'd lost. And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because I think it's run its course." Now, Brendan Hughes says that. He says that with some authority, and I do believe that he reflected the way that the majority of the members of the IRA and Sinn Féin do feel. Not all of them, because there are dissident voices, as you are aware, and I might talk a bit more about that in the Q&A session. But I do believe that they want to find a political way forward. The critical question is whether the Unionists are going to reciprocate. I think that the Republican movement have made major concessions. First of all, by putting the United Ireland on the back burner. They know they're not going to get a united Ireland by May 1998 or 99 or 2000 or 2000, whatever. The aspiration is there, but they no longer time limit it critically. And secondly, they recognise, and they really do, because there have been very important cross-community contacts between the two sides, not least between the political representatives of the loyalist paramilitaries and those of the IRA and Sinn Fein. They know they've got to reach an accommodation with the Unionists. Now, those are major concessions in Republican thinking, and Adams and McGuinness are walking the narrowest of lines, and their great achievement so far, and it's taken 10 years, is to bring the movement with them, bring the IRA and Sinn Fein with them, because they know that they hang together or they fall together. This was a famous quote from Brendan Behan, who said the first time when 3 IRA men are gathered together, the first item on the agenda is the split. Adams and McGuinness have, and not just them, but the leadership, those around them too, because they do not make the decisions unilaterally. There's a collective leadership in the movement of the IRA and Sinn Fein, know that they have to avoid the split at all costs, because if it splits, it's game, set and match to the Brits, is the way that they would see it. So that has been the strategy. We don't yet know whether the Unionists are prepared to move. And if they are prepared to move, which I think they probably will be, I'm not going to say so at the moment, and I hope they will be too, is that some kind of compromise settlement may come out. And it is going to be a compromise. It is going to be the freedom to achieve freedom, as Michael Collins said. I mean, that's how it would be interpreted. The critical question, as Joanne said, is whether, if a settlement is agreed, it is one that Adams and McGuinness can sell to the Republican movement. If they feel they can't sell it, they won't buy it. It's as simple as that, to avoid the split. And in conclusion, I just want to read the last paragraph from Behind the Mask, the American edition. Both editions begin with a description of the IRA trying to buy missiles in America when they fell foul of a very clever, sophisticated, highly successful FBI sting. And the person who was in charge of that operation on the IRA side was a person now living in New York called Gabriel McGahey, whom I refer to here. At the conclusion of all my many detailed interviews with the provos, I asked one final question: is the war over? Very few of them said that it was. But despite the inevitable uncertainties about the future, the provisionals and their supporters in America are largely at one with their comrades back home. They too support the leadership line, brought to them firsthand over the past 3 years by the most senior members of the Republican movement, from Jerry Adams to Joe Cahill, the veteran keeper of the IRA's conscience, and also its money. Gabriel McGahey, with whose story this book begins, served 7 years for attempting to buy red-eye missiles from undercover FBI agents. He too recognizes that there is now no other way forward. His words are indicative of how far the provos have come. McGahey said, "Looking back on it, we were never going to beat the Brits entirely, ever. I think now we've moved on to a phase which I think we should have moved on to sooner. We have to move politically to make it work. The Brits are never going to sail away into the sunlight like we all hoped. It's never going to happen. The facts of life are that we're in a position where there is a loyalist community and there's a nationalist community. We've got to learn to live together." Remember, this is the man speaking who was the IRA's senior person in America who tried to buy missiles in the 80s. We've got to learn to live together. There's no way we're going to get a united Ireland overnight. It's the same on the loyalist side. They know that within a lifetime, their power will have gone because of demographic changes. So we've got to come to the middle and work out some solution. I think Jerry and Martin are on the right track. History will show whether they are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very fascinating. Mr. Taylor has agreed to take questions, so would you please identify yourself and call on you. Susan?
Susan Gittleson, thank you for your very keen insights into what is going on. And I wonder whether, given your experience over 25 years or more, you would comment on the background economic, educational, demographic issues that will help or deter a peace process. You mentioned at the beginning some of the Irish Catholics who were so frustrated because they felt they didn't have a chance for career advancement. Now, what are the changes in the background economic situation that can help facilitate greater cooperation?
I think the changes are huge. I think it's a very important question. And it's not something I really touch on to any extent in the book or the series, but that is the background against which everything happened. They didn't happen for economic reasons, but the lack of opportunities for Roman Catholics in the late 60s and earlier is what fueled the civil rights movement that exploded and led to where we are now. Interestingly, one of the former IRA people I spoke to for the series, and I quote at length in the book, who was on hunger strike in 1981, called Gerard Hodgkins, who's a very bright, articulate, intelligent young man, again, who's done more than his share of time in jail. I saw him a few weeks ago, just before Christmas, when I went back and just talked to people about what they thought about the series and to have a sort of dialectic with them. And he said to me that he'd now left the IRA, he was going to get married, and the one thing that, and also he'd been approached by, well, anyway, I better not say that. But he wanted to get married and settle down, and the thing that he wanted was a job. Was a job. And I think a lot of former prisoners on both sides feel that. So the economic climate in which the peace process evolves is terribly important. Now, there was undeniably huge discrimination in the 60s, and gradually, the successive governments have moved to eliminate that. But in the end, the discrimination is in people's heads and hearts, if you like. So the institutional discrimination, Republicans would disagree with this. The institutional discrimination is gone. But I do think that, for example, the Fund for Ireland, and I haven't mentioned America's role in the peace process, which has been absolutely critical. I mean, I think that the White House and the National Security Council and Nancy Soderberg and Tony Lake and President Clinton have played a vital role, basically, in underpinning Adams, giving him the support that he needed so Adams can show the IRA that the peace process brings dividends. And I think the economic subventions that Americans and the American administration have given are very important. Educationally, the schools are still tragically divided. One side goes to one set of schools and the other side goes to the other set of schools. There are integrated schools, but they're still relatively few and far between, sadly.
Sidney Paul Day, there was one actor in this drama that you have not touched upon. The role, if any, influence, if any, of the present government of Ireland in relationship to the activities, to these meetings with Blair and so on. Is there an effectiveness there? How active are they? Are they going through diplomatic channels, say President, current administration in the United States versus the present government in Ireland itself, the Irish government?
Certainly in the book and the series, and forgive me for saying I've been talking for half an hour and I can't cover everything, but you're right to point it out that the role of the Irish government, the Dublin government, has been absolutely vital, because Albert Reynolds in particular was the critical figure in encouraging, through John Hume, Adams and the Republican movement to come in on the peace process. And critically, again, what has happened is that the axis has changed. That as a result of the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which Mrs. Thatcher was never over the moon about, but as a result of that, the decisions over Northern Ireland now rest not with any devolved body in Northern Ireland, because it doesn't exist at the moment, but rest with the British and Irish governments. And if there is no agreement by May this year, it is likely that the British and Irish governments will put a proposed solution through referenda to the people north and south at the same time. So the role of the Dublin government is absolutely critical, and I should have mentioned that, and you're quite right to point it out. There's no question about it. And again, one of the reasons why the process worked is because there was a very close relationship between the former British Prime Minister John Major and Albert Reynolds, the Taoiseach at the time. And also, Reynolds got on the phone to Bill Clinton at critical stages and said, look, Mr. President, or whatever Mr. Reynolds would say, you've got to go to the wire on this. And the President would say, how do I know they're serious? And Albert Reynolds would put his reputation and neck on the line and said, look, Mr. President, I'm telling you they are serious, trust me. And that was what it was all about. It was about relationships. It's about building trust. It's about building trust between the IRA and the intelligence services and the person I refer to as the contact. The whole thing is based on trust, which is why the first ceasefire fell apart at Canary Wharf after 17 months, because the Republicans felt that the trust had been betrayed. It's much more complicated than that, as you would have seen from my interview with John Major in the series. But the role of the Dublin government has been critical and will remain to be critical, because in the end, the two sovereign powers on the island of Ireland are the British and Dublin governments.
You mentioned that the British government's main idea was that somehow the two have got to learn to live together. But when the Troubles started in the 60s, the British sent troops up to sort of protect the Unionists, if you will, against the IRA. And I just wonder how you expect the Unionists to ever really give very much as long as they have British military
the troops
support.
didn't go in to protect the Unionists against the IRA. The troops went in basically to stop loyalists from effectively massacring Catholics. That's what happened. The Republican argument has always been, as long as the guarantee remains, the guarantee being that the majority of people in Northern Ireland are the determinant of what happens. If the majority, which is the Protestant Unionist majority, say, we don't want a united Ireland, or we don't want change, then you've got to go with that, given democracy and given the ballot box. Of course, as I'm sure all of you know, that the entity of Northern Ireland itself was artificially created to guarantee that very majority, which is why there's a problem in the first place. Partition was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to be a temporary solution, but it became permanent. And the Republican argument is that, until loyalists, unionists recognise that, the British are not going to back them indefinitely, there will never be change. It's not as simple as that. I mean, it really isn't. I think in the end, there are many unionists. Unionists want change. People on the ground, that's one of the reasons I think why the unionists are in the talks, because there was pressure from the grassroots on their side, like there was on the Republican and Nationalist side. So we had enough, 25 years. Frank Steele said to me, when he was still alive, he said in the interview I did, very movingly, he said the problem in 1972, which is a mirror of this process, when the ceasefire ended, is that neither side had suffered enough. But now, all sides, our side, the British side, the Republican Nationalist side, the Unionist Loyalist side, have all suffered enough. They've had enough. And they're saying to their political leaders, sort it out. Sort it out. But it's very, very difficult. And it's, when you talk to Unionists, they see Gerry Adams as, the leader of the IRA. They see Martin McGuinness as leader of the IRA, rightly or wrongly. But that is the perception. Changing that perception. Why should we sit down with murderers, with people with blood on their hands, when they see the delegation, the people who do the negotiating? Many of them are former IRA people, no question about it. Jerry Kelly, for example, was convicted of the London bombings in 1973, escaped from the Maze prison. You can understand, you have to try and understand. I have to try and understand, we all have to try and understand why unionists feel the way they do. And I can understand it, but what's the alternative? There has to be a degree of change on their side, or else we're going to carry on. And the IRA don't want to carry on fighting, but if necessary they will, I've no doubt about it. But after another 20 years, what will they achieve? That's the question. They recognise that. John Major said to me, if it's still going on, in 70 years' time, the British Army will be there if needed. And I'm sure Tony Blair would say the same. The message has got home. That is why what's going on at the moment is absolutely vital and very, very difficult to resolve.
How do you, Lansing Lamont, how do you interpret the latest spasm of violence over there in Northern Ireland? Is this the last dying spasms of both sides, or does it mean the crazies are still around and that neither the IRA nor the provisionals can control their own violently radical people? This doesn't bode very well for the future of the ceasefire.
What you have to remember is that the recent violence in Northern Ireland has taken place between two splinter groups. It is not the provisionals who've been involved. The provisionals are on a ceasefire, and they will hold that ceasefire until they're ordered otherwise. That the killing of Billy Wright was the leader of a breakaway loyalist paramilitary group called the Loyalist Volunteer Force, and he was under sentence of death from his own colleagues anyway, was assassinated, killed, murdered by the Irish National Liberation Army, INLA, who are not on ceasefire. They're on a sort of semi-ceasefire, a defensive ceasefire, or whatever they call it. So, you know, the provisionals, the Republican movement was not involved in that. And the loyalist paramilitaries, who are on ceasefire, the UVF and the UFF of the UDA, are still on ceasefire. And the problem is in reporting it and in people's sort of understanding of it, they think it's the IRA. It isn't the IRA. The IRA didn't kill Billy Wright. The Irish National Liberation Army killed Billy Wright. But the problem is that if the thing spirals and the tit-for-tat killings continue or escalate, and Catholics feel vulnerable again, why did the Provisional IRA come into being in the first place? Or what was one of the main reasons? Answer: the IRA was not there in 1969 to defend the Catholic nationalist community from loyalist attack. So if the community feels itself under attack, and if they feel, and I hope they don't, that, you know, the British Army and the RUC don't protect them, who do they turn to? The IRA. What price the ceasefire? That's where it's dangerous. Not because those involved are breaking the ceasefire, but because of the potential repercussions. And the whole thing is a cauldron. It just needs a spark, and woomph, that's it. That's why it's so difficult and dangerous, and people have just got to keep, you know, very clear, cool heads about it.
It's kind of a peripheral question of personal interest, but you've set forth the policy of the Clinton administration. What was the policy of the Bush administration, and who, if you know the names, were the prime movers associated with that policy?
I think the policy of the Bush and the Reagan administration was the policy of Mrs. Thatcher. I mean, we're talking about the 80s now. The attitude in the 80s was no give, no compromise. The IRA will not win. It was never spoken as such, but I believe that a decision was made, and the way that these things happen, that the British would give as good as they were getting, which is why the SAS were brought in. Not the SAS was told to go and kill, you know, known IRA men. It doesn't actually work like that, despite what Republicans think. But Mrs. Thatcher's philosophy was, you know, hit them and hit them hard. Don't compromise. Don't give them anything that will lead them to believe that they're winning. And that was reflected by Ronald Reagan and George Bush, who, you know, led a crusade against terrorism. And it was seen as, you know, naked terrorism. And many people still see it as that. Clinton and his administration are different. So in a sense, it reflected the changing mood. The mood changed when John Major became Prime Minister. And I said the other evening, I hope that history will be kinder to John Major than it is at the moment. We would not be where we are today were it not for the huge efforts that John Major had taken and had made, and the risks that he had taken. I think that there was a miscalculation in insisting on decommissioning. The elastic got stretched so far it broke, but I think that his policy was driven by the need to get the Unionists on board and keep them there, because if the Unionists aren't there at the talks, there's no point having the talks. And I think there was a miscalculation there. But we wouldn't be where we are were it not for John Major. And, you know, that was part of the changing climate when he came in and when Bill Clinton came in. So I think, you know, in a sense, the two administrations mirror each other through the 80s and the 90s. And America still has, I think, a, you know, vital role to play.
You alluded to some demographic changes that might militate against the Unionists. Could you elaborate on that?
The answer is nobody really knows. The general view is that Unionists were going to have to change because in 20, 30 years they will no longer be the demographic majority. Now that may or may not be the case. It may be 50 years, it may be 40 years, maybe 30 years. Nobody really knows. But the thing to remember is that just because if you were to have a Roman Catholic majority in Northern Ireland, that does not mean to say that all Roman Catholics would necessarily favour United Ireland. They don't. a demographic majority does not necessarily mean a nationalist political majority. And people have to just bear that in mind. But demographically, it is changing. The population ratio is now, people closer to it than I am at the moment would probably have the figures to hand, but it's something like 42%, 43% Roman Catholic, 50, whatever it would be, 53, 54% Unionist, Protestant loyalist, call it what you will. So the demographics have changed, but there's no guarantee that they are going to change the other way around, and that is going to happen quickly. And even when it does, it's going to mean United Ireland. I mean, the notion of United Ireland, as Republicans have fought for over the years, is the question people have to ask: is it really relevant to the Europe of the 21st century, when nation states are, rightly or wrongly, merging? I mean, Europe is an economic and dynamic political force. It's a sort of organic development, and to carry on this ancient conflict and Churchill's dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone rising above the mists post-Versailles in 1919, is a sort of mirror of attitudes that still exist today. I think that Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness and the leadership of the Republican movement recognise that there is change. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean a united Ireland, but the whole relationship between our two islands, and we're only a few miles apart anyway, is changing, which is why the relationship with the Dublin government is so important. And we're both members of the European community, and to carry on with this ancient quarrel in the 21st century, amidst these huge political changes, economic changes in Europe, is to most people is nonsense. So but you've got to find a way of accommodating the different aspirations, because until you do that, there'll still be conflict. So, yeah.
I'm interested in terms. For example, I'm a little confused. The Unionists are those people from Northern Ireland who want to unite with Southern Ireland, is that right?
No.
No. What are the Unionists?
Sorry.
Look at my list of
No,
items.
I know, it's very confusing. And I tend to take too much for granted, and I apologise.
I just want to finish my question. So
Okay, yeah.
The Sinn Fein, I'd like that defined.
Yeah.
And the Republican, what is their goal right now? And the Provisionalist, I'm all swimming around.
Okay.
Okay.
I hope if you read the book, it may become a little clearer, because I deliberately try to spell these things out. That the Unionists, Unionist is a political identity, right? They're called Unionists because they wish to remain part of the Union with Britain, right? Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales and England form the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. The majority of people within Northern Ireland are Protestants, right? Which is a religious denomination, obviously. The political manifestation of that is the Unionist Party, unionism. Unionism is about staying British, right? That's what the Unionists are. They're also known as loyalists. Loyalists is a much more general term because they're loyal to the Crown and the Queen. Sinn Fein is the political wing of the IRA. The Republican movement, as I say, is the IRA and Sinn Fein, although effectively, to those involved, it's the IRA. And the connections between the IRA and Sinn Fein are umbilical. There's no question about it. There are members of Sinn Fein who are members of the IRA. There are members of the IRA who are members of Sinn Fein. The only people who know with certainty where the line is drawn and who is who are the people themselves. And very few people can say with absolute certainty that so-and-so is the Chief of Staff and the Army Council, never, because very few people know. The security services, the intelligence services may know. They may know first-hand through technical surveillance. They may know second-hand through informers and agents. I don't know. So that's Sinn Fein. And your third one was? Provisionals. The provisionals. The IRA split. The IRA goes back to roots are in 1916, the post office in Dublin. In 1969-70, the IRA split into the provisional IRA, which is what the book is about, the shorthand for which is Provos, which is the name of the British edition of the book. It's not called Provos in America because nobody knows what Provos are. And they were called provisionals because they regarded themselves as the provisional government of the Irish Republic. The IRA regard themselves as the legitimate government in exile of Ireland. That's a huge concept to take on board, but they really do. They really do. And hence provisionals, that's why they were called the provisional government. They saw themselves. And those who went the other way were the officials, the official IRA, who in 1972 declared a ceasefire, which they've held, and now they went political. I mean, their arms are no doubt stashed away somewhere, but some of that organisation are now politicians in government in Dublin. Sorry, I'm sorry, because time is running out. Would you mind if I just moved on to...
My name is Albert Gottesman. Would you dare venture how you would see a solution to this problem? I mean, I looked at your program recently, and it's more baffling to me than the Middle East. I just don't understand how you would see a solution.
I think it is more difficult. I don't think it's necessarily more baffling. I think it is more difficult to reach a solution than it is in the Middle East, for historical reasons and individual reasons. I mean, I'm a journalist. I'm not a politician. I think there has to be an accommodation between the two traditions. And I think the sort of solution which is going to come out of it is, at the moment, a partitionist solution. It has to be. And the Republican movement recognizes that, but obviously can't say so, where you have a devolved government in which there is some form of power sharing between the two sides in the north, although it will never be called power sharing because that's a bogey word, again, for historical reasons to unionists, with strong cross-border institutional links. The critical thing is the dynamic of those cross-border links, that the Republican movement needs them to be real and have potential for growth, because they would see it as being the sort of embryo framework for a united Ireland. And the unionists, who run a million miles from any notion of any serious cross-border links with any meaning. And that's going to be the sticking point. The devolved government isn't a problem. Sinn Fein, I'm sure, will go into that, provided there are strong cross-border links that would allow them to believe that they could develop into the structures of a future united Ireland. And any settlement has got to be along those lines. There's nothing else realistically possible at this moment because of the attitude of the unions. Now, whether even that will happen is a moot point. I mean, one simply doesn't know. One has to wait and see. They tried, the British tried it in 1974 with Sunningdale. Basically, it's Sunningdale Mark II that we're looking at, but with more teeth. In the same way that Frank Steele said people hadn't suffered enough in 1972, unionists weren't ready for Sunningdale, and Sunningdale, frankly, was pushed too hard by the nationalists in 1974. So we will keep our fingers crossed. It's going to be very difficult, and there's no guarantee it's going to happen. I would be cautiously, underlining cautiously, heavily optimistic.
Unfortunately, our time has run out, but I'd like to thank you for educating us, provoking our curiosity, and for those of you who want to know more, and there is a glossary, I invite you to buy the book, and Mr. Taylor will be signing it behind the mask.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.